Welcome to 10 Minutes a Day, a daily reading of the Catholic Church's social encyclicals. We interrupt the planned progression of the documents to bring you Magnifica Humanitas, the brand new encyclical of Pope Leo XIV on safeguarding the human person in the time of artificial intelligence.
We are also witnessing a disconcerting loss of historical memory, as first-hand accounts of the Holocaust and the two world wars are disappearing. This leads to a selective or distorted rewriting of the past, in a context where fake news and the manipulation of narratives obscure the lessons that have been learned. Without a living memory of the horrors of war, political decisions risk being made on the basis of power alone, without any consideration for the long-term consequences. To all of this, the media and digital dimensions are adding new and decisive elements. Communication networks, fragmented information environments, and algorithms that reward conflict can magnify polarization and resentment, increase propaganda, and make shared discernment more difficult. Thus, war is not only fought, but also culturally conditioned through simplistic narratives, a friend or foe mentality, disinformation, and fear. When historical memory fades and the ethical principles that protect civilians and the most vulnerable are weakened, it becomes easier to justify violence as necessary, inevitable, or even sanitized. It is in this context that humanity is slipping into a violent culture of power, where peace no longer appears as a responsibility to be taken on, but as a fragile interval between conflicts. Today, more than ever, without prejudice to the right of self-defense in the strictest sense, it is important to reaffirm that the just war theory, which has all too often been used to justify any kind of war, is now outdated. Humanity possesses far more effective and capable tools for promoting human life and resolving conflicts, such as dialogue, diplomacy, and forgiveness. The use of force, violence, and weapons reflects a relational poverty that has always had disastrous consequences for civilian populations. The growth of the military-industrial complex has become a defining feature of the current political landscape and has become a key sector in the economy of various countries. The close link between economic interests, the military apparatus, and political decisions produces an armed nation, in which war appears as a natural extension of politics, and the arms market becomes an autonomous driving force behind military decisions. Nor can we ignore the enormous economic interests behind war. The armaments industry and countries that supply weapons profit from a market that thrives precisely on conflicts. In this sense, there are also financial interests that contribute to fueling tensions in various regions of the world. Military arsenals are receiving renewed attention. In the past, recognition of the threat posed by weapons capable of destroying all of humanity had promoted paths towards detente and disarmament negotiations. Unfortunately, this approach has been left behind, and the evolution of nuclear arsenals, including the prospect of its tactical use, makes the use of such weapons seem less improbable. In this context, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which came into force in 2021 with the support of over 70 countries, is an important step. However, it risks remaining largely symbolic, since the major nuclear powers have not agreed to it. This has led to the widespread, yet erroneous belief that nuclear deterrence is an indispensable prerequisite for security. This has also contributed to a new arms race, which is hard to control and accompanied by the gradual dismantling of nuclear reduction agreements, as well as the development of miniaturized weapons that make their use seem like a more viable option. The same logic applies to conventional warfare. Military force, weak diplomatic initiatives, and the complexity of the interests at stake contribute to conflicts that tend to become protracted, with extremely high human and environmental costs. It is much easier to start a war than to stop it, and yet discussion on conflict prevention remains tragically marginal. The situation is further destabilized by the presence of new armed operatives, such as jihadist groups, private militias, and criminal networks that mark the end of the state's monopoly on the use of force. Often these groups intertwine vague ideological motivations with concrete economic interests, transforming war into a way of life for entire generations of young people and children. Here, the objective is no longer a definitive victory, but the perpetuation of conflict as a source of power and income. The above-mentioned scenario is linked to the unceasing development of weapons systems, particularly those involving AI. The Holy See has recently observed that the growing ease with which the autonomous weapon systems can be deployed makes war more feasible and less subject to human control. This violates the principle that armed force should only be used as a last resort in cases of legitimate self-defense. For this reason, the development and use of AI in warfare must be subject to the most rigorous ethical constraints to guarantee respect for human dignity and the sanctity of life, and to avoid a race to develop such arms. Sometimes there is talk of artificial moral agents, as if machines were able to distinguish between right and wrong with greater consistency than a human being. Yet moral judgment cannot be reduced to a calculation, for it involves conscience, personal responsibility, and the recognition of the other as a person. Therefore, it is not permissible to entrust lethal or otherwise irreversible decisions to artificial systems. No algorithm can make war morally acceptable. AI does not remove the intrinsic inhumanity of conflict. Indeed, it can only bring about conflict more quickly and render it more impersonal, lowering the threshold for resorting to violence, transforming defense into threat prediction, and thus reducing victims to data. In this way, it will accustom us to the idea that violence is inevitable and needs only to be optimized. This does not diminish the importance of instilling, as far as possible, values and sound judgment into the artificial systems we build, so they can contribute to a moral ecosystem in which humans are better able to listen to their own consciences, as well as allowing AI models to establish appropriate boundaries. Is that enough to invoke a general type of ethics? Concrete criteria for discernment must be established. The first such criterion concerns personal responsibility. When a decision to strike becomes automated or opaque, the risk of abdicating responsibility increases. For this reason, the chain of responsibility must be identifiable and verifiable. Those who design, train, authorize, and employ technology must be held accountable for their decisions. The second criterion pertains to the moral time frame for making judgments. While AI tends to expedite the decision-making processes, speed and efficiency should never be the supreme motivating force for the irreversible decisions made in the context of war. The third criterion is the identification and protection of civilians. Any technology that facilitates attacks without seeing the face of human beings lowers the moral threshold of conflict. Target selection and the use of force must not confuse combatants and non-combatants, nor ignore the impact on defenseless populations. These criteria give rise to certain non-negotiable requirements. First, all systems used in a war setting must guarantee the possibility of retracing and reconstructing decision-making processes, so that accountability and blame are not collapsed into the machine. Second, the decision to use lethal force cannot be delegated to opaque or automated processes, but must remain under effective, self-aware, and responsible human control. Finally, it is imperative to establish a shared framework, also at the international level, in order to curb the technological arms race and to ensure robust protection for civilians and the infrastructures necessary for their survival. The culture of power also stems from the crisis of the multilateral system. The institutions established to safeguard the concept of a common future for all peoples and a global common good appear to have been weakened. This is due not only to structural limitations, but also to a frequent lack of shared will to support and reform them, or to recognize their moral authority. Instead of making progress, we are regressing from a significant turning point of the 20th century. After 1989, the collapse of the communist regimes in Europe was followed by a predominantly economic globalization, which lacked an adequate political framework capable of sustaining dialogue and peace. An almost blind faith was placed in the ability of the markets to generate prosperity, democracy, and stability. In reality, rather than automatically generating unity and peace, globalization has provoked fundamentalist, identity-based, and nationalistic reactions. The result is a far cry from genuine multilateralism. Instead, what has appeared is a disorderly and conflict-ridden multipolarism with a prevailing sense of mistrust. What has also reemerged is the temptation to forge a collective identity in opposition to an enemy, fueled by narratives in which each party portrays itself as a victim entitled to retribution. The reduction of complex issues into simplistic categories, me first, friend or foe, us or them, facilitates decisions that are often irresponsible and undermine mutual trust among nations. The force of international law is thus replaced by the claim that might makes right. Consequently, tribunals that are competent for settling disputes between states or dealing with war crimes are often weakened or bypassed, with devastating ramifications for political culture and social cohesion. In this context, peace building has been relegated to a secondary one. Cooperation for development, disarmament, conflict prevention, the establishment of mutual trust are neglected in the name of power politics. The achievements of humanitarian law are also being compromised. Indeed, the principle of proportionality in responding to aggression, protection of access to water, food, and essential goods, and respect for the lives of civilians, especially children, come to be regarded as naive relics of the past.